If you're like me, I used to be an engineer, so I do love structural stuff. Before I became a pastor, I was a mechanical engineer, so I used to like making things and fixing things, and I still like to make and fix things, actually. But a building, if it's going to be strong and stable and secure, it needs a good foundation. We touched into this last week with our pause week when we looked at the words of Jesus, who talked about the wise builder. He talked about the man who built his house on a rock. He said, as everyone who comes to me and hears my words and puts them into practice, I will show you what they are like. They are like a man building a house who dug down deep and laid the foundation on rock. When a flood came, the torrent struck the house but could not shake it because it was well built. But the one who hears my words and does not put them into practice is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. The moment the torrent struck that house, it collapsed, and its destruction was complete. Now, Jesus knew the importance of good foundations for good structural strength in buildings, and so he encompassed that in this analogy of the man who puts my words into practice. Is like the man who takes the time to lay a good foundation before building, because that foundation will affect the quality and the capability of that particular building, that particular house. So having a good foundation means that a house is likely to stand longer and be able to withstand all the adversities that come against it. And all your modern houses will have good foundations, because if they didn't, they wouldn't still be standing probably, because over time the wind and everything else will actually cause a problem. And in this area there's lots of clay, and that clay does cause us a problem because it expands and contracts, and it affects our houses, and some houses suffer with subsidence because of that, but most houses are okay because of their foundations. Now, modern foundations are normally made of concrete. You don't see them. They're underground. They're down there to take the load of your house and make sure it doesn't sink or subside or shift. And that's what your foundation is doing in your modern house. And that's the thing about foundations. Once your house is built, you can't see the foundations. They're there. They're doing their job, but you can't see them. They're physically hidden underground, just working away, making sure your house stays strong and stable. They also determine the size of the house that you're going to build. I used to work in the water industry, and we used to build water treatment works. And when you're doing water treatment, you have massive tanks that have to hold huge amounts of water, and those tanks weigh an enormous amount of weight, and they have to have massive foundations to be able to stand on. This very building, Riverside Press, used to have huge machines in it. So if you look at our foundations, this slab underneath your feet is about 2 feet of concrete, because this building used to have to take massive heavy machinery that weighed an awful lot. So the foundations, even of this Riverside church, in its structure, are very big, very strong foundations actually within the building itself. So the foundations aren't visible, but they play an enormously important part in the nature and the structural strength of the building. They support and inform what goes above. And it's the same for our church. Our foundations, they support and inform what goes above and what grows out of this particular church ministry. They make Riverside the church it is. And in this series, we want to unpack some of those foundations, some of those things that are in our foundations, and inform the sort of church that we are and what goes on, if you like, above the waterline, what you can see in terms of our expression of ministry. And also what's going to inform the ongoing building and growing of this church as well. So our foundations are really, really important. Today, I want to start with a bit of our history as a church. You might have been around for a long time, you might have been around for a short time, but I want to do a quick overview of our history and how some of that history sits within our foundation. You're not a follower of Jesus just in isolation. You're part of God's ongoing story. And when God draws us, He calls us. When we follow Jesus, we're drawn into a family, and we're also drawn into a story. No follower of Jesus exists in isolation. We're part of God's greater story of reconciling all things to His love. And so if you've joined Riverside, you're part of the Riverside family. You've joined God's story that's expressed through us. You're part of God's story expressed through the ministry of this church. So I just want to give a quick recap of how the church was birthed and some of our key points in our history. Now, next year, this church will have been around for 100 years. 100 years, okay? It'll be our centenary. So the church will be 100 years old from its first inception. And over that time, it's taken various forms. It all began back with two people, these guys, Mr. Herbert Bradbrook and Mrs. Evans, back in 1925. Now, am I right in believing, Margaret, that these are your relatives? So who is this lady on the screen? She's your great-grandmother. Isn't that fantastic? Your great-grandmother had this vision for a church expression in this area with this gentleman on the screen, Mr. Bradbrook. The Tankerton Estate Company were starting to build housing in this area, and these guys thought there needed to be a Christian expression amongst those people who would be moving into this area. There needed to be a Christian presence. And so the vision was born within these guys' hearts to lay a foundation for a church that still exists here today. Now, I'd love to have been a fly on the wall just to know how the Spirit of God was moving in their hearts and encouraging them to do something in this area all those years ago, encouraging them to create a space where people could encounter the love of Christ. The Apostle Paul tells us that any foundation we lay first has to be laid on the foundation of Jesus. He says this in 1 Corinthians. He says, "By the grace God has given me, I laid a foundation as a wise builder." Notice the continuing referring there to wise building. "And someone else is now building on it. But each one should build with care, for no one can lay any foundation other than the one already laid, which is Jesus Christ." So Paul talks about laying a foundation, but his foundation lies upon the primary foundation of Jesus Christ. And he builds wisely so others can come along and build on top of that. So the foundations, again, affecting the integrity and the ongoing health of what Paul is laying down in terms of his church planting. And he encourages each new generation, each new person to build with the same care that he's building with. But he recognizes the ultimate foundation is Jesus Christ. That's the ultimate foundation. We sing about Jesus being the rock on which we stand. And Jesus is the ultimate bedrock, the foundation we go down to begin our building. And on that foundation, we can lay a foundation. And so back in 1925, these guys, they were building on the foundation of Jesus. And we can thank them that the foundations they laid were good enough for us still to be around today, can't we? Isn't that amazing? That we're 100 years on and the foundation they laid has basically lasted, that we're still here 100 years on. Now, just to give you some context of the time frame this was the same year that television was invented. 1925 was the year that John Logie Bard successfully transmitted the first ever television picture. Do you want to see the quality? There it is. That's Stooky Bill. He's a ventriloquist dummy. They had to use a ventriloquist dummy because the lights had to be so hot to create the radio signal for the TV that it would have burnt any human to pieces. So they had to use a ventriloquist dummy called Stooky Bill, and he was very singed by the whole experience. But you can find this footage on YouTube, and the conversation that John Logie Baird has with Stooky Bill is kind of spooky because it sort of speaks about how television will have this power over people, and it's kind of prophetic. But anyway, we're not going to get into that today. Doctor Who did a whole piece on it if you're interested. But there's Stooky Bill. 1925, the same year the church was birthed, the same year television was invented. That gives you an idea of how far we've moved in the past century. But by 1926, the church had decided to meet in this bell tent, this marquee. They were having Sunday services. And then by 1927, they basically built this first little property. That sign says free church, which I think is great. It means you don't have to pay to go in. No, it doesn't mean that. I'm joking. It means basically they're an independent expression. They're not linked to any other denomination at that point. So they're a new independent expression of God's presence in the area. And again, I love the fact that there's freedom in our foundations. It says in Galatians 5, Paul says, for freedom, Jesus set you free. And there's freedom in our foundations. And that freedom, I think, is really key to who we are. We want to be a people who live in freedom, not under sort of religious dogma or any kind of sense of guilt. We want to be people who live free because God loves us and Christ is with us. So freedom is right there in our foundations all those years ago, back in 1927. Well, they quickly outgrew that small building and they built a new building, which many of you will recognise, in Northwood Road. So in 1933, the church moved into that building in May of that year. And that's the building that many of you may have been familiar with. That was the building we were in before we came across to this new site. And so that building holds many memories. A quick peek inside. Look at that huge pipe organ. They're dominating the right side of the church. And that pipe organ was there right until 1979, for good or for bad, I believe. It wasn't until 1979 that was replaced with a modern electric organ. So that building was the home of the church for a long time, and that church was a consistent presence in that community. All through the Second World War, that church was present there with various different leaders leading the church those times. And I think one of the things that's really spoken to me as I've looked back over this history is the consistency of this church, the reliability of this church to be a presence in the community. And I love the fact, again, we're continuing with that tradition going forward. People trust us. If we say we're going to do something, they trust we will do it. And we'll do it well. And we'll try and do it to the best of our ability. And that reliability, I think, has been there throughout sort of history of what was called Tankerton Evangelical Church back in the day, or TEC as it was known. So that church existed for decades in that community, right up until the recent time. Now, some of you might not be aware, but the church was going to have a new building project called the Paddock. They were looking to build a new building up by the Tesco roundabout on that piece of grass there on the left-hand side. And that was explored really strongly, and it looked like it was going forward. But regrettably, it didn't. It fell through. Planning permission wasn't granted. And so in 2013, that whole project kind of came to an end. And we need to recognise there's some degree of pain and loss there in our foundation, some degree of disappointment, because the church was wholeheartedly behind that project. And when the whole thing kind of fell through, there must have been deep disappointment. This was before Keely and my time, so we didn't experience that part of the church history. But there must have been deep disappointment and confusion as to why this thing wasn't happening when it felt like God had said it would happen. And there was a potential for what we called the betrayal barrier, wasn't there? Which we talked about a few weeks ago in our mountain series, a potential to feel like God had somehow betrayed the church and not delivered on what it felt was going to happen. But this church has got good roots in Jesus. It's got good roots, and the church continued to believe that God had a new home for them. They, sort of pulled themselves up and then began to think about, okay, Lord, if it's not the Paddock, what's next? And God had a good plan. He had, in fact, a better plan. He had this plan. And with the help of some local people, this site was found, and it was purchased in 2014. Here's Chris getting the keys. Chris is our former pastor, collecting the keys from the former owners. So this was an industrial space, laying vacant for a while, and it was purchased in 2014. And we began to work hard on it. Work began in 2015 to convert the space. This is where you are now. This is how the auditorium used to look, as it was just an industrial space. And this is when we joined the story. We kind of connected with the church in 2015. We come from Birmingham to take over from Chris as the outgoing pastor. So we kind of entered the story just as this whole thing was beginning to happen. The church had just gone through a renaming process, not deciding that Tankerton Evangelical Church was a bit too parochial as a name for the church with this growing vision. And they prayed and they decided that Riverside would be the new name for the church going forward. It would encompass a broader and wider brief, a broader and wider ministry. The work was completed in April 2016, and this popped on my feed this week. Almost 8 years to the day, we had our first service in this room. And that was a Facebook post from the night before, just thanking everyone who worked really hard to get this space ready for our first service on May the 8th. Almost 8 years to the day. Can you believe it? 8 years to the day until we moved into this space for the first time. It's worth just asking the question, how did all this happen? How was all this funded? Because you need to understand this whole project, including the purchase of the site, the massive extensive renovations, the purchase of all the equipment, including nearly 300 chairs that you're sitting on, the installation of the cafe space, all this came to nearly £2 million. Nearly £2 million of project value. And so did the church win the lottery? No. Did we find a magic money tree? No. Have we got golden goose laying golden eggs? No, we haven't got any of those things. All this came about because of the historical and ongoing generosity of you people, of the church. That's how we're able to be in such an extraordinary facility as we're in today. People have chosen over the years to be generous. That generosity initially enabled the church to build that property in Northwood Road, enabled the church to buy a bungalow next door to extend for office space and kids space, enabled the church to buy a manse. This is all historical generosity in the foundations of the church. And so when it came to basically moving forward into this space, we had some historical generosity we could realize. The old church site was sold for $750,000. The manse had already been sold for $355,000. But then there was opportunity for the church to be generous again. And the church was invited into a season of generosity, and over £400,000 was given by some of you people towards the value of this project. And also over £170,000 was loaned to the church in interest-free loans to be paid back as and when. And it's worth remembering this was from about 150 people in total. And so when we came down, we thought, wow, this is a massive leap of faith, because we hadn't encountered a body of people who were prepared to move forward in such a big leap before. And so it really felt like God was doing something special with this church. The final piece in the project finances, we took out a mortgage for £620,000, which we're still paying back today. So from the vision of two people back in 1925 and a tent to this. Isn't that incredible? To where we are now. So this is our journey. This is what's in our foundations. And we see that continuum of generosity that God is expressing through us today. And I think the key thing is, if you're part of the Riverside Church family, whether you're new to the church or you've been around for a long time, don't ever take this generosity that's in our DNA, in our foundations, for granted. Now, there's a downside to having a facility like this. People come into the building and they think we're rich. They think we're a rich church. They think we've got an oil well somewhere. They think we've got some sort of secret income stream that somehow is funding everything that happens here. They think somehow we're rich, or they think the whole thing has somehow dropped out of the sky as if by magic, and we've somehow just been arrived at this place without all that connection to our history. I had a local businessman last year who wanted to donate to All Wrapped Up, so he came into our cafe space, and I met him and talked to him briefly. He wanted to donate a few £1,000 to All Wrapped Up, and I waited a few days and nothing happened, and I waited a few more days and nothing happened. So I thought I'd email him, and I emailed him. I said, you came in, you're interested in All Wrapped Up, and I have heard nothing back from you. And he said, I came in, he said, I looked around, and it appears you don't need any help. And I was like, oh, you've got completely the wrong end of the stick. Because All Wrapped Up is about a £25,000 project. All happens through the generosity of you people and the generosity of local people. So I emailed him back and I said, you need to understand that what you see is a result of historical generosity dating back 100 years. That's what you see. That's the fruit of what you see. And people are continuing to express generosity today. I said, I didn't say we haven't got a golden goose. I said, but it's not the fact that we've got this secret income stream. I said, it's ongoing and historical generosity that enables us to do all we do. And that includes All Wrapped Up. It's all through ongoing generosity. And that's really important, because people can come in and think, well, you guys have clearly got money, and that's great. But it's all about ongoing generosity. And just get super practical for a moment. Money only comes into this church from a number of ways, okay? It comes through regular giving. It comes through one-off gifts. It comes through, sometimes people leave us a legacy when they pass away. It comes through renting our spaces out for conference and room hire. And our cafe produces a modest income, but our cafe is not designed to be a business venture. It's designed to be a welcoming space, so we don't run it to be a massive profitable space. We keep our prices down so many people come and enjoy that warmth and welcome. And we can also apply for grants for our different projects like Grow Baby or our youth space, and we're successful with some of those, but there's a massive amount of people trying to get grants. So sometimes they come, we've got a small grant for a football cage, £3,000 towards the cost of that, which is great. So in our youth space. And we also raised some money by selling some of the back of our building to Oyster Cars. Oyster Cars store nice cars at the bottom of our site, and they used to rent the space, but we decided to sell some space to them at the back of the building, and that raised some income for us. And some of that income has gone to pay off £100,000 off our mortgage. So our mortgage balance is now £440,000. We've been chewing that away over the years. We paid off all £170,000 worth of interest-free loans back to people, which is fantastic. Some of those people decided to generously convert those loans to gifts, which was amazing. We invested £110,000 into our youth hub space and our Grow Baby space, and we invested £10,000 in our lower lounge recently to make it a much more welcoming and refreshing space. But all these things, they don't mean that we're rich. They mean we're trying to steward the money and the resource that God gives us. We're trying to be wise and be continually to be ongoingly generous as we move forward as a church. We want this place to be a place that's good for everyone. We want this place to be a place that everyone comes in and feels the love of God, and we're seeing that over and over again. Now, there's different income streams I mentioned there. We've only got the team, the staff team and the leadership team, have only got control over some of them. We can try and make our conferencing work well. We can try and make our cafe work effectively. We can apply for grants. That's the bit we have control over. We have no control over your decision to be generous, or your decision to be someone who gives to the life of the church. We have no control over that. The choice always rests with you. You may have been someone who gave generously to the Riverside project and helped us to be where we are, and that's fantastic. Thank you so much. You may have been someone who gave an interest-free loan. Again, wonderful. You may have been someone who converted an interest-free loan to a gift, which was incredible. Thank you so much. You may be someone who's joined Riverside and now is giving generously to the ministry of the church, and that's wonderful. So the thing, we often get it wrong with the offering baskets because we're trying to really downplay the fact we don't like talking about money. You know, we don't get someone on the keyboard playing E minor for 5 minutes, making you feel guilty, making you feel like you should give. We're not that sort of church. But sometimes I think I've done you a disservice by not explaining to you some of this stuff, and explaining how this whole thing works and how it has come about. So you might have been somebody who's come in and thought, these guys clearly don't need my money. Clearly they've got some way all this happens, and they clearly don't need my giving. They don't need my generosity to support it. But to be honest, nothing could be further from the truth. The only reason all this exists is because of the ongoing generosity of the church community that's existed over all these years. And I say all that to say generosity is in our foundations, and we want it to continue into our future. We want it to continue into our future. Because the worst case scenario would be the church grows and grows and grows. More and more people come and experience all this wonderful space and love of God, but they don't connect with that generosity in our foundations. They don't connect with that ongoing need to be a sacrificially generous, giving people. And that part of our history dies away. And we become a church that increasingly has to look for different ways to raise money, to continue on with the vision that we feel God's given us. And I'll talk more about this in a week or two, but I wanted to say this is a really important part of our foundation, because all this just didn't drop out of the sky. It came because of choices by individuals over decades to be generous and sacrificial with what God put in their hands. And that's why we get to be here today. We get to stand on the shoulders of those who've gone before us. So let's not ever take that for granted. That's part of our history, part of our foundations. But bring us right up to modern times. In the last 8 years since we've been in here, we've seen an awful lot of change, haven't we? We've seen God do so much stuff in this space and through this space. At this time of year, I get to write what's called the annual return for the Charity Commission. And every year I have to look back at the previous year and see what God has done. And then write that into a report, which goes to the Charity Commission. And what the Charity Commission are looking to do, they're looking to say, are you doing what you said you would do when you constituted this charity? Are you doing what you said you'd do? So we've got some core aims around sharing the gospel, about equipping people, about improving the quality of their life, about bringing relief to those who are needy. So I write up all the things we've done that fulfill those objectives. And the Charity Commission then look at that and go, okay, you can continue to be a charity. You're doing what you said you were going to do. And the great thing about it is you look back and you get to see all the wonderful things that God did. And you go, I remember that and I remember that. And it's like, isn't God great? And just some highlights from last year. Tina going off on mission to the Logos Hope, refreshing our lower lounge space to make it more welcoming, expanding our rooms for the Kingfishers group to make them more space, work on the Youth Hub started last year, all wrapped up, presents for 560 kids went out through All Wrapped Up at the end of last year. And this is just a snapshot of some of the things that happened in our history last year. And every year, like Paul says, we're like the wise builder building another layer of God's kingdom upon our foundations. We're adding another layer to our history of the expression of all that God's doing. And it's incredible to celebrate, because sometimes we're moving forward at such a pace, we don't take time to stop and reflect and say, isn't it amazing what God has done? Isn't it amazing what God is doing? Part of our more recent history in 2022 was our All One series, and the reason we got to be where we were yesterday and be an encouragement to all those people in London was because of the journey we went on to become a fully affirming church. And that's had massive impact on our reputation with our local community, creating a safe space for anyone to come and not be discriminated against. Valuing the uniqueness in every person and creating a deeper trust of community. So why all this talk about history? Well, Jesus said this. He said, every teacher of the law who has become a disciple in the kingdom of heaven is like the owner of a house who brings out of his storeroom new treasures as well as old. And Jesus was linking the continuum of God's story that had happened through the Old Testament writings right up to the time when he was speaking about the gospel, the kingdom of God coming in a new way. And he was connecting those two things together using this analogy of a man bringing things out of a storehouse that were old and things that were newer. There's a continuation. And our story is a continuation. We have old treasures in our storehouse. We've talked about some today, this treasure of generosity, this treasure of reliability. These are old treasures which are continuing forward in our story. But then Jesus is writing new bits for us. He's adding new treasures to our story. This new treasure of growing in reputation, this new treasure of being this fully affirming space, this treasure of being this church that focuses more on authenticity than a need to feel like they're right or they're religious. All these things are part of our new story that's been laid down. And we want to keep growing as a community. We want to keep growing, learning from each other, learning from the Holy Spirit, moving forward in God. And as each year passes, like a wise builder, we try and put down another layer and another layer in this continuation of God's story, always recognizing that Jesus is our ultimate foundation. We'll always be a Jesus-centric church because he's the ultimate foundation on which we stand. We don't just occupy this house that's been provided for us by the generosity of the people of the past. We inhabit it. We inhabit it and we steward the space that's been essentially created for us over all those years. We inhabit it and we honor it and we add to it as we move forward with God. We add to it the new treasures that God reveals to us. And so I encourage you again today, you're part of God's story, you're part of God's family, you're not in isolation. We do this together, we journey on together, and we all have our part to play. We all have our part to play in the building of the future. The Apostle Paul, he puts it this way, he says, instead, speaking the truth in love, we'll grow to become, in every respect, the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ. From him, the whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament, grows and builds itself up in love as each part does its work. So the question for us all today is, what is our part to play? What is your part to play? The body of Christ grows up and builds itself up as each member does its work. Each person does the part that God has given them. And you've all got unique gifts, you've all got unique personalities, you've all got unique experiences. God's saying, I want to use that to help build the church. help to continue this story of God. And many of you do some amazing ways of expressing what God has given you to do. But if you haven't found your place yet, I'd encourage you that God has a place for you. He has something for you to do. None of us are called just to sit and watch and spectate in the kingdom. We're all called to play our part. We're all called to be part of this body of Christ that builds itself up into maturity. Your past experience of church, maybe before you came to Riverside, it might not have been great. There may be things in your foundations like pain and loss, and there may be mistrust. And all those things may be causing you to be kind of bent out of shape and not willing to fully commit or to trust. There may be loss in your foundations that is hindering you from moving forward. But God doesn't want those things to stop you entering into his story. So I encourage you to allow God to bring healing to you, to allow God to restore trust, to allow God to release you to do the part that he's called you to play. He wants you to be fully engaged in his ongoing story. We all have our unique part to play, and that helps us grow up in maturity, and that's what's happening at Riverside. You know, majority of people are engaged and connected and moving forward and growing, and that's beautiful to see. I just want to encourage more and more of that. God can speak to you, he can heal you, he can restore you, he can speak about the vision for your life and how you connect. Don't ever think that Riverside is a finished article. We've just begun, guys. We've just begun in terms of all that God has for us. We have this incredible space, from a tent to this in 100 years. But who knows what the next 100 years will bring in terms of an expression of God's love for this area and for the coastlands. You are now what Paul describes as the living stones. You're the living stones. You're the material that God is using to build the house. And so each part is integral to the next. So please stand if you're able. We're just going to spend some time praying. Just felt what I said sort of links back to that picture, that coat hanger that I had at the end of worship. And, you know, the thing is, God isn't trying to turn you into a particular shape. You know, he's not trying to make everyone uniform in that sense, because we're all individual and unique. And that uniqueness is the power of the church. You know, God can take your uniqueness and he can knit it into the fabric of unity that is building the church, that is bringing the kingdom. And so what that means is some of the things you think about yourself that aren't, you know, we always look at our faults, don't we? We always look at all the things that we feel we're doing wrong, we're not getting right, and sometimes that's how we see our uniqueness, but actually your uniqueness is your superpower, the way God's made you and the way God knits you into a body. That brings this beautiful diversity and strength to the church family. That's why God describes the church as his manifold wisdom, his best work. His best work. And so, as we just worship, just allow the Holy Spirit to speak to you. Speak to you about how much he values you in your uniqueness and how valuable you are in the kingdom. And maybe let him speak to you a little bit about what God, remind me again, what's my part to play? What's my part to play?